deal. All right, so now we're recording. Thanks for joining us, Marian and virtual, and then anyone who watches this afterwards, thank you for joining us today. We're talking about how to secure your Zoom meetings and pretty much how to be a good Zoom host. So all I mean by good Zoom host is that you know what tools are available to you and you know how to use them in the event that you need to. So we're going to start by going over how to go through your settings and make sure that whatever settings you have are the ones you want, what each setting means, some important security settings, and how to set up a meeting that is secure and in the best way that it can be set up in order to be secure and ready to go. So we're going to start by going over to our Marywood Zoom page. And I have it up right here. For those not familiar, our Zoom page is marywood.edu/Zoom. So if you want to be super fancy, this marywood-edu.zoom.us is technically the URL, but marywood.edu/Zoom gets you here as well. If you're on campus, you might want to add the 3 W's in front, just in case. For me, it didn't work, but for you, it will. So that being said, this is where you go to set up and join and host meetings. But more often than not, I find myself going to the sign into your account button. And if you're not signed in already, you will have to click sign in with Google and then select your Google account. But because I already signed in today, it brought me right to my meetings page. So by default, you come right here to a calendar of your future meetings. I can see right now that I'm currently in this one because there's a little video camera next to it. But if you want to go to your settings, you click over on the left, and it starts with meeting settings. We also have recording settings and telephone settings. We're only going to be talking about the meeting ones today because they have all the security settings that we want to look at. So by default, it just kind of lists all of the different setting sections here. You can select one to jump to that section, but if you keep scrolling, you'll find them all. At the very top, we have waiting room, which is probably the best thing to have in your arsenal because whoever joins your meeting from the link will then appear in this waiting room and you can kind of vet who comes in and who doesn't. You can admit people when they get into the waiting room, or you can decline them if you're not sure who they are and they're not supposed to be here. So you can kind of determine from here who is allowed into the meeting. And if you're the host or even the co-host, you'll probably hear a little noise when someone comes in to the waiting room so that you know that someone's there. And there'll be a pop-up somewhere on your screen. Even when you're screen sharing, it'll say someone's name and then admit. And you can click admit right here in the meeting, and then they're able to come in and set up their audio. So this is pretty important. You can turn it off for certain meetings though. So as long as you have it on in your settings, you're able to toggle it on and off for future meetings. If you just have this turned off, it means you can't use it for any meetings until you turn it on again. At least that's how I understand it. So then under waiting room options, they have some like customization things. You can customize the waiting room with like logos and branding if you want to go that far. You can also determine who goes in the waiting room. I usually just keep it at everyone though, just so, anyone who comes in gets thrown into the meeting room, whether you're part of Marywood or not. And especially here at Marywood, since mostly faculty and a few staff have accounts, if you're inviting students to your Zoom meetings, you want to make sure that everyone goes in the waiting room, unless you're pretty certain that your classroom Zoom meetings won't be entered by anyone else. If they're on Moodle, it's probably the fact that they won't, be allowed to go to anyone else. So as we keep going, there are little passcode settings. I don't use the passcodes too much. They do get sent out in the invitations though. So if you are trying to enter a meeting, you may ask for a passcode, and then that's pretty much what these settings mean. So as long as you keep them on, each meeting gets its own little passcode, which is good because then you need that passcode to enter a certain meeting. So I just kind of keep these on. I believe on the administrative level, this require a passcode for new meetings is permanently on, so you don't have to worry about if it's turned off or not. mostly for instant meetings. If you want to host one like right from your Zoom page, that's pretty much what these little settings are for. So we also have authenticated users can join meetings. And I only mention that because we can't really use it unless you're talking exclusively to faculty who you know have Zoom accounts. Not everyone on Marywood's campus has a Zoom account, so we can't have only authenticated users join, especially if we're having students in our meetings, because they don't have their own accounts. So they won't be able to join a meeting where only authenticated users are allowed. So just wanted to bring that up. Mine's turned off for a reason. So let us see. There is this waiting room setting for phone-only users. I keep that on. I haven't had a lot of phone-only users, but you might. So this kind of just puts them in the waiting room, just like everyone else who's using a computer, and then you can add them as normal. Let us see. As we keep going down, I made notes about schedule meeting section. You can choose to have the participants not have video if that's something you want to do, especially if it's more like a public meeting. That's something you can toggle on and off in the meeting setup page anyway, but you can turn it off and on from here as well. Here's another one that's important. You allow participants to join before host. And that pretty much means if you have your waiting room turned off, you can turn this on to allow participants to join before you do. Now, if you're wanting to make this a more secure meeting, maybe you don't want to do that. But if it's like a private meeting with you and your department, this might be a good option. If you're doing a more large scale meeting, I'd probably keep this unchecked just in case. I also have this mute all participants setting on almost all the time, because as you'll find with most of these settings, as long as they're turned on in this main settings page, you can toggle them on and off in the meeting itself. So this is a good example. I have mute all participants when they join a meeting by default, and then in the meeting itself, I can actually turn that on and off whenever I need to. So if it's a meeting where I kind of want them to talk as soon as they come in, or that I want them to say hello and not automatically mute them, I could turn that off from within the meeting itself instead of doing it ahead of time. And I have a couple pictures to show you that'll illustrate that, but I just wanted to bring that up. And then under in meeting basic, we have something for chat. I have private chat turned off, and if you have a more public meeting, like for the whole Marywood community, maybe you also want to do that, just so we don't have, or just so you don't have participants one-on-one chatting with each other, you know, just in case there's some manner of harassment or other, you know, hopefully not, but you're never sure. So I have private chat turned off, so all chat that happens is something that everyone can see. So again, from within the meeting itself, you can turn off chat to the public, or, you know, all the participants. I can turn off chat so that whoever is chatting directly to me, the host, or I can have them chat to no one, so they can't actually chat, or they can chat to all participants. So I just wanted to bring that up as well. I mentioned that sound notification before for the waiting room. This is a little important just because for people's sanity, the host and co-host at the moment are the only one who can hear when people come and go. And it's kind of like an opening door sound. But if you want everyone to hear that and everyone knows when people enter, you can change that. But I usually keep it to host and co-host so I don't interrupt anybody else. That's just something I wanted to bring up. And then co-host is another really great option here. I have this turned on all the time because it allows you to add co-hosts from within the meeting, which is really nice. You can also add alternative hosts in the meeting setup, as we'll see in a couple minutes, but they have to have Marywood accounts. Whereas co-hosts, you can set up within the meeting for participants who are already there. If you had a guest speaker come in and you saw them in your participant list, you can change them to a co-host so that they have sharing screen opportunities. So it kind of lets you determine who's able to have certain permissions instead of allowing all people to screen share, as we will see as an option. So co-host is super important. And then we have our screen sharing settings, which I mentioned just a little bit. Right now I have it on that only the host can share. And again, this is something you can change within the meeting itself. So if that is going to change, like you want to do some presentations with your students and you want them all to share their screen, you can change that within the meeting itself. So I always keep it at host only until I'm in the meeting, and then I kind of determine on a case-by-case basis. And I believe that's pretty much it for the overall settings, except for maybe this one, allow removed participants to rejoin. If you actually removed a participant, as you could do as a host, this would allow them to rejoin if you turned it on. But odds are, if you're removing a participant, it's for a good reason. So I usually keep it off. But there's always the inevitable technical difficulty where someone gets kicked out of a meeting for some reason, and this would not allow them to rejoin. But I haven't had that issue happen, or I haven't heard it happen. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. There's also this allow participants to rename themselves, which I have on by default, but if you're worried about people changing their names to something that isn't so great, maybe you want to turn this off so that whatever name they set when they come in is the one they have, but that's completely up to you. So I believe that is actually it for these settings here. I just wanted to go over a couple different security settings that you can adjust before you start making your meetings. But then of course there are more as we actually create some meetings. So I'm going to scroll all the way to the top here. And I'm going to actually go over to meetings and schedule a meeting to show you some features that are important to keep in mind. So over here on the right of my meetings page, I have the schedule a meeting button. And it opens up pretty standard set of fields. We have our topic at the top, which of course we could say is Riley's meeting. You can put in a description if you like. And then we have our when, how long, is it recurring, all those fun things. Now the first setting that I recently found, but I know other people already know of its existence, is the registration element. And if you click required on this, the link that you get after you set up this meeting and save it is actually a link to the registration instead of a link to the meeting. So when you send out a link, it's the registration link, and people have to fill out a set of fields, and then you can actually approve the registrations before they get the meeting invitation. So it's kind of like another step to getting the meeting information. Kind of makes it a little more secure because there's more work into getting the meeting information instead of just sending it out in an email. So I'll keep this on so I could show you what it looks like. But it is a pretty cool feature. We also have our passcode, which every single meeting gets. And you'll notice our check mark for waiting room is here. I'm going to keep it checked. We have our video and our audio as normal. And then we have some meeting options, including allow participants to join anytime. We have mute participants upon entry, which I keep checked, as I said before. Require authentication isn't really useful because not everyone has Zoom accounts here. Breakout room pre-assign is the same thing. It doesn't really apply here. And then there's automatically record, of course, which isn't really relevant. But we also have the ability to turn on alternative hosts. And this is important if you have other Marywood members who you want to have as co-hosts with you, but they must have a Zoom account through Marywood already. So if I put in Kat's email, it would work, but if I put in someone else's who doesn't have a Zoom account, it would give me an error message. But before I click save, I just want to go through one more time, make sure I have all my settings. So I have my registration required, so I can see what that looks like. I have my waiting room checked off. I do not have the checkbox checked for allow participants to join anytime because I want them to go to the waiting room first. And then I have mute participants upon entry. And I have an alternative host already built in. So whenever Kat joins this meeting, we're both host and co-host, and we can both do pretty much everything.
Hey, Riley.
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, if you have the waiting room enabled and join before host enabled, it will still put them in the waiting room.
Oh, right, that's right. Waiting room trumps everything else. So if you had that turned off and then turned on that people can join before the host, that would be an issue, but waiting room takes precedence. Thank you, I forgot to mention that. All right, so now we have our meeting details after I've created it. You'll notice since we turned on registration that right here, instead of an invitation link, we have a registration link. So I'm going to copy that for my own sake so I can show you what that looks like. And then we have just a summary of all the things that we checked off. There's also the ability to save this thing that we just did as a meeting template. So if you know for the future that this is the kind of setup you want for a certain type of meeting, you can save this as a meeting template so you could use it in the future. So this is especially important if you wanted to keep your registration for certain meetings that are more important and require a registration. You can save it as a meeting template and then use that template for future meetings. So it's kind of nice. You don't have to remember all the certain settings you picked. You can just save it as a template. Now, if you did choose to do registration, there is an extra step you need to do, and that is under this registration section. And if you look at it, it says manage attendees, and we have 0 registrants because I did not send out the link yet. We have our registration options, and then we have the edit button over here. So I'm going to click on edit, and it brings up a couple sections for me to review. At the top, we have approval. So this is what happens when someone registers. Are they automatically approved, or do I have to approve them myself? And if you want that extra step of security, I would say manually approve, just because then you get an email. If you check this box to send an email, you will get an email every time someone registers, which could be good or bad, depending on how many people you're intending to join. You'll get an email every time someone registers, and then you have to come back to your meeting page to approve or deny them. So depending on what questions, as we'll look at in a second, depending on what questions you have in your registration form, this might be very useful to have an approve or deny system, or of course you can just automatically approve them and hoping that having a registration link is like the thing that deters someone who's not supposed to be there. So I'm going to keep it on manually approved so you can see what that looks like. And then we also have the notification section where you can get an email sent to you every time someone registers. You can turn that on if you like. If you don't get an email sent to you, you just have to come back to your Zoom meeting page to see the amount of registrants that registered for this meeting. Then you can close the registration after the event date, which makes sense. And then you can allow attendees to join from multiple devices, which you might want to keep on in case someone uses like the computer to just watch the meeting and then the phone to listen to it. And then show social share buttons on registration page. I'm going to turn that off just in case. So then on the questions tab, we have pretty much just a checkbox system of what you want included in your registration form. So by default, first name and email address is required. So it'll already ask them for their first name and their email address. So then last name is also checked off here, and I checked it as required so they could put their last name as well. If you want to go so far as asking for address and city, country, zip code, state, all of these fun things, you can check all of these off and say whether they're required or not. But I'm going to save all because I think first, last, and email is good enough for me, but you may want to go a little more in depth with your form. I'll click Save All. And then if we look down here under registration, we'll see that because I turned on manual approval, we have a certain number of approved as well. We have the option to send an email to host and all of these fun things we decided upon. I just wanted to come back in here real quick. You could create your own questions for the questions on the form. So you would just do that by clicking new question and going through the prompts. So now I'm going to copy this invitation again. And I'm actually going to copy the link part of it and open up an incognito window just to show you what the registration form looks like. So if I sent this link out to whoever and they opened it up, they would see the topic of the meeting and the time it's happening. And then they have our 4 fields that they need to fill out. So if it was something like Stephen George and his email address is something I can actually check for you. Workshops, sure, why not? So he has his first and last name, and we have an email address. You have to enter it twice to make sure that it's right, and then they can click register. Now, if you didn't have a manual approval set up, this is where they would get the joining information. So if you had it automatic, as soon as they filled out the registration form, they would get the link for the meeting. But because it's manual approval, they get the meeting ID, but they don't have the passcode or the join link or the phone number. So this is where you come in and you get a nice little email. And I'm going to go back, see if I actually got the email. So if you set it up to get an email notification for registration, you should see it in, I have it in updates because I have my inbox set up a little differently, but it will say something about meeting registration. And when you click on it, you'll see that the person's name and their email has registered for that meeting. And that's all the email is going to say, because you need to go in and approve it from the Zoom page. You can't do that from the email. So if I were to refresh my meeting page here and scroll to the bottom, we'll see that I have one registrant and I didn't approve them yet. So I can go to edit and see how many people have registered, what their name is and their email address and when they registered. And then I can check them and approve them. And they should get an email saying that they are, able to come to this meeting now, and here's the information. So I actually think, because I put in an email that I can check, I should have gotten an email to this workshops account because I set that up as Stephen George's email. And when they get approved for the meeting, they'll get this confirmation message that apparently Google deems as unsafe, and it'll give them all of the meeting information. So it'll have a link to add to the calendar, it'll have click here to join for the meeting, and of course the phone numbers. So it's an extra step that could be nice if you are looking to have like a registration sort of thing. If you want to approve them yourselves, that's an even further step of security. And then you'll have a nice little way to vet who enters your meeting. So that's pretty much the registration process. That is pretty much one of the biggest things that I've noticed in terms of security for new meetings is entering or enabling this registration tool, but you don't need it all the time. It's really if you're looking to do a bigger Zoom meeting and you want to be more mindful of who is coming into it. If it's something like a departmental meeting or a class meeting, maybe you don't need it, but it's completely up to you and it's available to you, which is important to know. Now, I keep mentioning that you can toggle some settings within the actual meeting itself, and I can't actually show you that from our meeting, so I took some screenshots just so you can see what it would look like. So one of the first ones I want to mention is this participant settings. So when you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a whole bunch of little icons, and one of them is participants. And when you click on that, you'll see like your list of participants on the right, and you'll see a couple little commands at the bottom, like mute all, I think is one of them. So you could use that at your discretion. But then there's an ellipsis button. And when you click on that, you get these options as a host. So you can ask everyone to unmute if they're already all muted. You can mute participants upon entry. You can allow participants to unmute themselves, or you can disallow them to. You can allow participants to rename themselves, or you can disallow. And then you can play the sound when someone joins or leaves, and you can enable the waiting room. So all of these things can be checked or unchecked at any time during your meeting, and that's under the participants button. So that's something to keep in mind. Another one is the chat. So when you click on the chat button, it opens up like a little text box in the bottom corner, and any messages that happened previously will be above it. But there's also an ellipsis here, and when you click on that, you can determine if participants can chat with no one, so the chat is disabled. You can have the participant chat with only the host, so whenever they type something, only you see it, not everyone. And then you can have them chat with everyone publicly, so everyone can see every message that comes in. And that's usually the default, but do know that you can change that if you need to. Another one that is useful is the security button. And as a host, I'm pretty sure that is specific to the host. You will see the security button, and you'll see some similar settings here. When you click on security, you can lock the meeting or enable or disable the waiting room. You can also change whether participants can share their screens, chat, rename, or unmute themselves. So you can do all that from the security button. And then we have on the sharing button, there's a little caret icon to the top right of the green button, and you'll see how many participants can share at a time, which is usually one, but you can change it to multiple if you need to. But then if you click advanced sharing options, you will see these settings here, which is very similar to what you saw in these Zoom settings. You can change how many people can share at a time. You can change who can share at any time. So right now I have it on only host and co-host, but I can change it to all participants if I want to. So that's all there in the sharing options. And then I think the only other thing I entered in here was from this webinar Kat and I attended last week. They had do's and don'ts of setting up your meetings. So some useful do's are turn on your waiting room, require a passcode, which we already do. This one doesn't really apply, the registered or domain verified, because not everyone has an account. Control screen sharing, which we just kind of discussed, and mute participants so they don't, interrupt until you want them to discuss. Then you can always unmute them. And then as for don'ts, we have don't use personal meeting IDs, which we didn't really discuss because not everyone really uses them. Don't post your meeting link publicly. Don't allow participants to rename their ID, which also makes sense. Don't enable private chat, and don't allow participants to rename themselves. So a couple things we already talked about, but I just wanted to bring that up because I found it kind of useful. Kat, was there anything else that I missed or you had any ideas about?
Nope, I think that was fabulous and hit on all of our big points.
Awesome. Marianne, did you have any questions for us? I know you're on the typing. If you want to say something in the chat, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, don't worry about it. Just looking through my notes to see if I missed anything, but I'm pretty sure we got it all. Oh, I did want to mention, I don't have a screenshot of it, but when you're in the participants list, you can hover your cursor over any participant to get a more menu, and that's where you can remove them or mute them or do whatever you need to that participant in the meeting. So I don't have a screenshot of that, unfortunately, but that's where you would do all of those fun things. So if there are no questions, I guess I will stop the recording and thank everyone, future and current, for watching. And hopefully you can make some secure Zoom meetings. But if you have any questions, please reach out to the help desk and we will definitely be in touch. So I'm going to stop on that.